That morning, my husband flew overseas with his mistress. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're going to regret this trip." He laughed, slipped off his wedding ring, and left it on the table. "Really, I'm not even coming back." Then he walked away. The next morning, my phone rang. It was him. His voice trembled. "Please, tell me what's happening." The strange thing is that when my husband finally left me, I didn't cry. Not at the airport. Not in the parking garage afterward. Not even during the 40-minute drive back to our house in Naperville, Illinois. For 18 years, I had imagined dozens of scenarios. In some of them, I screamed at him. In others, I begged him to stay. Sometimes, I threw his clothes into the yard while the neighbors watched through their curtains. But when the moment finally arrived, I felt something completely different. Relief. The kind of relief that settles into your bones after carrying a weight for so long that you've forgotten what standing upright feels like. My name is Claire Thompson, and at 42 years old, I had spent nearly half my life married to Eric. When we first met, he was charming in the way many ambitious young men are. He had confidence, energy, and dreams that seemed larger than life. I admired that about him. I believed in him. More importantly, I believed in us. We married when we were both in our 20s. Back then, neither of us had much. Our first apartment was a tiny one-bedroom unit above a dry cleaner. The plumbing rattled whenever the neighbors showered, and during winter, cold air slipped through the windows, no matter how many towels we stuffed underneath them. Yet, those were some of the happiest years of my life. We worked hard, we planned, we sacrificed, and slowly, things improved. Eric built a successful career in commercial sales. I worked in financial administration before eventually moving into consulting work that allowed me to spend more time with our daughter Lily. Together, we bought our first house, then a larger one, then a lake property in Wisconsin. From the outside, we looked like one of those families featured in magazine advertisements. Successful, stable, happy. The truth was more complicated. The change happened gradually. At first, Eric simply became busier, then busier turned into distant. Distant turned into dismissive, and dismissive eventually became cruel. Not physically cruel, never that. His cruelty came in smaller forms, more sophisticated forms, the kind that leave no bruises. He interrupted me whenever I spoke. He rolled his eyes when I expressed concerns. He acted as though every achievement belonged to him alone. If someone complimented our home, he'd say, "I've worked hard for it." If someone admired our lifestyle, he'd talk about his career. Rarely did he mention the countless hours I spent managing our finances, overseeing investments, handling taxes, paying bills, researching opportunities, and quietly protecting our future. At first, I ignored it. Marriage has seasons. At least that's what I told myself. Then one evening, about 6 months before everything collapsed, I found the first undeniable proof. Eric had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. I wasn't snooping, at least not intentionally. A message appeared on the screen, a heart emoji, then another, then words no wife should ever have to read. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought I might be mistaken. I wasn't. Over the next few weeks, the truth became impossible to deny. The woman was named Vanessa. She worked in his office. She was younger than him by nearly 15 years. The relationship wasn't new. It had been going on for months, maybe longer. I remember sitting alone in my car outside a grocery store one afternoon, staring at the steering wheel while rain tapped softly against the windshield. I could have confronted him immediately. Most people would have. Instead, I did something Eric never expected. I got quiet, very quiet. I started gathering information, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted clarity. I met with an attorney, then another. I reviewed account statements, property records, investment documents, retirement funds, insurance policies, every detail. The deeper I looked, the more something became painfully clear. Eric had spent years believing he understood our financial situation. He didn't, not even close. The family home had been purchased using funds from an inheritance my parents left me. The lake property was solely in my name. Several investment accounts originated from assets I'd inherited years before. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything was transparent. Eric simply never paid attention. Why would he? For years, he assumed I would always be there handling things behind the scenes. Like a stage crew member nobody notices until the lights stop working. The months that followed changed me. Not because I became stronger, because I became realistic. I stopped trying to save a marriage that only one person was interested in saving. I stopped making excuses for his behavior. I stopped protecting him from consequences. Meanwhile, Eric became increasingly bold. He spent more away from home, more business trips, more excuses, more lies. By the time summer arrived, he wasn't even trying very hard anymore. Then came the morning at O'Hare Airport. The morning everything finally ended. Vanessa stood several feet away, pretending not to watch us. She looked uncomfortable, not guilty, just uncomfortable. Eric set down his coffee and looked at me with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the power. "Claire," he said, sounding almost annoyed, "this doesn't have to be dramatic." I remember studying his face, the face I had loved for 18 years, the face that no longer felt familiar. Then I said the words that had been sitting quietly inside me for weeks. "You're going to regret this trip." He laughed, actually laughed. Then he slipped off his wedding ring. Just like that. 18 years reduced to a piece of metal resting on a coffee shop table. "Really?" he said. "I'm not even coming back." For a second I thought I might feel anger. Instead I felt pity, because he truly had no idea what was waiting for him. He picked up his suitcase, turned around, and walked away. Vanessa followed him. Neither of them looked back. I watched until they disappeared into the crowd. Then I picked up the wedding ring. Not because I wanted it, because somebody had to clean up after him. One last time. As I walked toward the parking garage, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my attorney. Everything was ready. The paperwork could be filed at any time. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I typed 4 simple words. "Go ahead, file it." Outside, a plane crossed the morning sky. Somewhere inside it sat my husband, convinced he was flying toward freedom. He had no idea he was actually flying toward the most expensive mistake of his life. The morning after Eric left, I slept better than I had in months. That surprised me. I had expected grief, maybe even panic. After all, 18 years of marriage doesn't simply disappear overnight. No matter how damaged a relationship becomes, there are habits that settle into your life like furniture. You get used to certain sounds, certain routines, certain expectations. For years, I had listened for Eric's footsteps coming down the hallway every morning. That day, there were no footsteps, no shower running upstairs, no television playing financial news in the background, just silence. And for the first time in a very long while, the silence felt peaceful. I woke up around 7 o'clock, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen island while sunlight poured through the windows. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled. I was halfway through answering emails when my phone started ringing. The caller ID displayed Eric's name. I stared at it for a moment. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." The voice on the other end barely sounded like him. "Claire." I frowned. His voice was shaking, not angry, not irritated, shaking. "Eric." A long pause followed. Then he spoke again. "Please tell me what's happening." I leaned back in my chair. For several seconds, I didn't say anything. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, because I genuinely didn't understand what he meant. "What are you talking about?" His breathing sounded uneven, almost panicked. "My cards aren't working." I blinked. "What?" "My credit cards," he said. "Every single one of them. The hotel says payment was declined. The rental car company called. Something's wrong with the accounts." Suddenly everything made sense. I looked out the window. A squirrel was running across the backyard fence. Life continued exactly as normal. Meanwhile, somewhere in Europe, Eric's world was beginning to collapse. I took another sip of coffee. "Nothing's wrong with the accounts." "Then why can't I access them?" "Because they're not your accounts anymore." Silence. Then a sharp breath. "What does that mean?" I kept my voice calm. The same calm voice I'd practiced with my attorney countless times. It means the joint accounts have been legally separated. Separated. Yes. Claire, what the hell are you talking about? I closed my eyes briefly. There it was, the familiar tone. The assumption that I owed him explanations. The assumption that reality should rearrange itself around his expectations. Eric, I said quietly, I filed for divorce yesterday. For several seconds, all I heard was breathing. Then came a string of curses, loud enough that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. When he finally stopped, I remained silent. Eventually he asked, You filed yesterday? Yes. You planned this? I almost laughed. Planned it? Of course I planned it. Responsible adults plan major life decisions, especially after discovering their spouse is having an affair. I prepared for it. I said, That's not the same thing. His voice rose. You waited until I left the country. No. I stood and carried my coffee toward the living room. I waited until you made your choice. The silence that followed felt different. He wasn't listening. He was calculating, trying to figure out what this meant, trying to estimate damage, trying to regain control. Finally, he asked the question I'd been expecting. How much money did you move? There it was. Not an apology, not concern about our marriage, not regret. Money. I sat down on the couch. Money that belongs to me remains where it belongs. What does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. Another pause. Then I heard a second voice in the background. Vanessa. She sounded anxious, as though she was asking him questions, as though she was beginning to realize the luxury vacation she expected might not be as luxurious as advertised. The thought would have been amusing if the situation weren't so sad. Claire, Eric said, lowering his voice. Just tell me what's happening. I already did. No, you didn't. His frustration was growing. You moved money. You locked me out of accounts. I separated finances. You froze everything. I followed legal advice. You can't just do that. Actually, I can. The truth hit him in stages. I could hear it happening, like ice cracking across a frozen lake. Slow, uneven, dangerous. Then his voice changed. The confidence was gone. What about the house? My attorney had predicted this exact question. I almost smiled. What about it? The house. What about the house? Eric. Another long pause. Then that's our house. I looked around the living room. The house my parents' inheritance helped purchase. The house I'd spent years maintaining. The house he'd barely noticed unless something needed fixing. Actually, I said, you should read the documents. The silence became even longer. Then I heard something rustling. Paper. Apparently, he had already received the legal package electronically. He was opening files while speaking to me. A few moments later, his breathing changed. He found the property records. I knew the exact moment because his voice suddenly became very small. What is this? The deed? No. More papers. More clicking. More confusion. Claire. His voice cracked. Why is your name the only name on this? I stared at the family photographs sitting on a nearby shelf. Pictures from vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. A life built over decades. It's always been that way. That's impossible. No. I spoke softly. It's documented. He sounded genuinely shocked. Not because anything improper had happened, because he had never bothered paying attention. Over the next 10 minutes, he discovered one surprise after another. The lake property, several investment accounts, various inherited assets. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was secret. Everything had existed exactly where it always had. The only difference was that he was finally looking. At one point, he became angry again, accusing me of deception, manipulation, even revenge. I listened patiently. Then I asked a simple question. Did you ever once ask to review our financial records? He didn't answer because he knew the truth. He never had. For years, he assumed he understood our situation. Confidence had replaced curiosity, and arrogance had replaced responsibility. Eventually, his anger burned itself out. What remained sounded much worse. Fear. Real fear. The kind that appears when someone realizes they may not be nearly as secure as they believed. Before hanging up, he asked one final question. What am I supposed to do now? I looked toward the kitchen. The wedding ring still sat inside a drawer where I'd placed it after the airport. such a small object, such enormous consequences. Then I answered honestly, the same thing everyone else does. Eric, what? Live with your choices. The line went quiet. A few seconds later, he disconnected. I sat there for a long time afterward, not celebrating, not smiling, just thinking, because despite everything, there had once been a time when I loved that man deeply. There had once been a time when hearing fear in his voice would have broken my heart. Now, it simply made me sad. Later that afternoon, another email arrived. This one wasn't from my attorney. It came from a travel notification service connected to a shared rewards account. I noticed a new flight reservation. 1 passenger, Vanessa Carter, departure, the following morning, different destination, different itinerary, no return flight with Eric. I stared at the screen, then slowly closed my laptop. The fantasy was already beginning to crack, and Eric still hadn't seen the worst of it yet. 3 days after Eric's phone call from Europe, I received another one. This time, it came shortly after dinner. I had just finished washing dishes and was sitting on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Summer evenings in Illinois had always been my favorite. There was something comforting about the familiar sounds. Sprinklers running in distant yards, children riding bicycles down the street, neighbors walking their dogs. Ordinary life, the kind of life I had spent years trying to protect. My phone vibrated against the patio table. Eric. Again, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. What is it, Eric? For a moment, all I heard was silence. Then a tired voice said, She's gone. I already knew who he meant. Vanessa. Yeah. I looked out across the backyard. The old maple tree swayed gently in the evening breeze. Somehow nothing about his news surprised me. When did she leave? This morning. His voice sounded hollow, as though something inside him had finally broken. She booked a flight and left. I didn't respond immediately. There wasn't much to say. After all, Vanessa wasn't the cause of our marriage ending. She was merely the symptom of a much larger problem. Eventually, Eric spoke again. I thought she loved me. The sentence hung in the air. Sad, childish, almost unbelievable. For months, he had convinced himself he was living some grand romantic story. He imagined himself as a man brave enough to pursue happiness while conveniently ignoring the destruction he left behind. Now, reality had arrived. Reality is rarely romantic. Eric, I said quietly, she barely knew you. Another silence followed. Then he laughed, a bitter laugh, the kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they've been avoiding. Maybe you're right. Maybe. The word almost made me smile. For years, certainty had been his favorite language. Now everything had become maybe. Maybe he wasn't as successful as he thought. Maybe he wasn't as irresistible as he believed. Maybe the life he abandoned had more value than he realized. The conversation drifted for several minutes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to win an argument. He wasn't trying to dominate the discussion. He simply sounded tired, very tired. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. Did you ever stop loving me? I leaned back in my chair. The answer wasn't simple. People imagine love disappearing all at once. In reality, it often fades gradually, like sunlight at the end of the day, 1 degree at a time. I don't think so, I said. He was quiet. Then I continued. I think I stopped recognizing the person you became. The silence stretched, long enough for me to wonder whether the call had disconnected. Finally, he spoke. I don't know when everything changed. I did, but explaining it wouldn't accomplish anything. The truth was that marriages rarely collapse because of one dramatic event. They collapse because of thousands of small decisions, thousands of moments when one person chooses themselves over the relationship, thousands of opportunities to show kindness, respect, gratitude, or loyalty and chooses not to. That was what happened to us. Not overnight, over years. After we hung up, I sat outside for nearly an hour, thinking, reflecting, remembering. The strange thing about heartbreak is that even after someone hurts you deeply, you still mourn who they used to be, or perhaps who you believed they were. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The divorce process continued. Lawyers exchanged documents. Financial disclosures were completed. Paperwork moved through the system exactly as it was designed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just reality. Meanwhile, Lily visited more often. Our daughter was 21 now and finishing college. She had handled the divorce better than I expected. Not because she wasn't hurt, because she had seen more than either of us realized. One afternoon, we were sitting together at a coffee shop downtown when she surprised me. I knew Dad was cheating. I nearly dropped my cup. You did, she nodded. For months. My stomach tightened. Why didn't you say anything? She looked down at her drink, then gave a sad little shrug. Because I thought you already knew. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Children notice more than parents realize. Far more. Lily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You deserve better, Mom. Simple words. Yet they nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because I needed validation, because hearing them reminded me how much of my life I had spent accepting less than I deserved. Over the next several months, something unexpected happened. I started enjoying my life again, not in a dramatic movie montage sort of way, in ordinary ways, real ways. I joined a weekend and hiking group. I reconnected with old friends. I took a short trip to Colorado. I started accepting consulting projects I'd previously turned down. Little by little, the world became larger. For years, my life had revolved around managing crises created by someone else's ego. Without that burden, I suddenly had energy for myself. The contrast became even more striking whenever Eric called, and he continued calling, not constantly, but enough. Each conversation revealed another piece of the reality he was facing. The first major shock involved his finances. Eric had always viewed himself as the primary architect of our wealth. Now he was discovering how incomplete that understanding had been. Several investments he assumed belonged equally to both of us originated from inherited funds. Other accounts had grown because of financial strategies I spent years developing and managing. He wasn't broke, far from it, but he wasn't nearly as wealthy as he imagined. That realization seemed to shake him profoundly. Then came the professional problems. At first they were subtle, a delayed business opportunity, a partnership that suddenly cooled, a client who became difficult to reach. Nothing catastrophic, yet the pattern continued. One evening during a phone call, Eric sounded genuinely confused. I don't understand. Understand what? People are treating me differently. I didn't answer, because I already knew why. Years earlier, my father had quietly introduced Eric to several influential people in his industry. Not because Eric asked, because my father wanted to support our family. Many of those relationships evolved into opportunities. Many opportunities evolved into success. Over time, Eric convinced himself he had built everything alone. Now, those same connections were fading, not because anyone was punishing him, simply because relationships require maintenance and gratitude, both qualities Eric had neglected for years. The most painful moment came near the end of summer. Eric called late one evening. His voice sounded defeated, not angry, not frightened, defeated. Claire, yes, I think I understand now. I waited. Then he said something I never expected to hear. I threw away the wrong person. The words lingered between us. Heavy, honest. Too late. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment, I felt sorrow, not satisfaction, not triumph. Sorrow, because by then, I knew something Eric didn't. The hardest consequences weren't financial. They weren't legal. They weren't professional. The hardest consequence was realizing that the people who genuinely loved you are often invisible until they're gone. And by the time you finally see them clearly, it may already be too late. By the time autumn arrived, the divorce had moved from shock to reality. The leaves across our neighborhood turned shades of red and gold. Children filled the sidewalks on their way to school, and life continued with its usual rhythm. One of the strangest lessons I learned during that period was that even life-changing events eventually become normal. At first, every document from my attorney felt significant. Every phone call carried emotional weight. Every conversation seemed connected to the end of my marriage. Then gradually those things became routine. The divorce wasn't my entire life anymore. It was simply one part of it, and that realization felt surprisingly liberating. One Saturday morning, I was cleaning out a closet upstairs when I found an old photo album. I sat on the floor and began turning pages. There was Eric at 25, standing beside our first apartment. There we were holding newborn Lily, family vacations, birthday parties, camping trips, Christmas mornings. For a while, I simply looked, not crying, not smiling, just remembering. People often assume that moving on requires erasing the past. I found the opposite is true. Healing comes from accepting the past for what it was, both the good and the bad. Eric had hurt me. That was true. But it was also true that we had once built something meaningful together. Pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. A few days later my phone rang again. Eric. I answered. Hi. His voice sounded different than it had during previous calls. Calmer, more measured. There was less panic in him now, less denial. We spoke for several minutes about practical matters related to the divorce, property evaluations, tax documents, deadlines. Eventually the conversation shifted. Can I ask you something? Sure. Did your father ever help me get my first regional account? I paused. The question surprised me. Yes. Silence. Then I thought I earned that on my own. I looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was covered in fallen leaves. For a moment, I pictured my father, a good man, a humble man, the kind of person who helped others quietly and never expected recognition. You did earn it, I said. What do you mean? My father opened a door. I paused. You walked through it. Another silence. Then I added, but opening doors matters, too. That seemed to hit him hard, because what Eric had begun discovering over recent months wasn't that his accomplishments were fake. They weren't. He worked hard. He built relationships. He developed skills. The problem was that he had rewritten history in his own mind. Over time, he erased every person who helped him along the way. He turned every shared success into a personal victory. Now, he was being forced to confront a more honest version of reality. And that reality wasn't comfortable. Over the following months, more truths surfaced. Some were financial, some were professional, many were personal. One afternoon, I received a call from a longtime family friend named Richard. Richard had known both me and Eric for nearly 20 years. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he hesitated. Then he said something interesting. Eric reached out. I wasn't surprised, and he said he wanted help connecting with a client. I waited. He seemed shocked when I declined. A sad smile crossed my face. That sounds like Eric. Richard chuckled softly. Then his tone became serious. You know what I think happened? What? For years, he thought relationships were transactions. I remained silent. Now he's learning their investments. After hanging up, I thought about that sentence for a long time. Relationships are investments. Not financial investments, human investments. You build them through consistency, trust, respect, gratitude. You can't neglect them for years and expect them to remain unchanged. The same principle applies to marriages, and friendships, and families. Everything worthwhile requires maintenance. Around Thanksgiving, Lily came home for the holiday. We spent most of the day cooking together. Nothing fancy. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, pumpkin pie, the usual American tradition. At one point, she looked around the kitchen and smiled. You seem happier. I laughed. Is it that obvious? Very. Her answer was immediate. Then she became thoughtful. You know, after Dad left, I worried you'd become bitter. I stirred the gravy while considering her words. Honestly, I worried about that, too. And I smiled. I realized bitterness would give him power he doesn't deserve. Lily nodded, as though she had been hoping for that answer. The truth was that revenge had changed meaning for me. At first, I wanted consequences. I wanted fairness. I wanted reality to catch up with Eric. And it did. But eventually, I discovered something more satisfying. Freedom. Real freedom. The freedom to stop organizing my life around someone else's mistakes. The freedom to stop carrying resentment. The freedom to move forward. That winter, my consulting business expanded significantly. A former colleague offered me a partnership opportunity. Several new clients came aboard. For the first time in years, I felt professionally energized, not because I needed to prove anything, because I genuinely enjoyed the work. One snowy evening in January, nearly 10 months after Eric left for Europe, he called again. The divorce was almost finalized. Most major issues had already been resolved. His voice sounded tired, older, somehow. Claire, yes, I owe you an apology. I remained quiet, not because I didn't want to hear it, because I wanted him to continue, for once, without interruption, without excuses, without qualification. And he did, for several minutes. He talked, not about money, not about legal settlements, not about Vanessa. He talked about himself, his arrogance, his selfishness, his entitlement, the way he had taken people for granted, the way he had treated loyalty as something automatic, something permanent, something guaranteed. When he finally finished speaking, neither of us said anything for a while. Then I asked quietly, "Do you mean it?" "Yes." The answer came immediately. No hesitation, no performance, just honesty. For the first time in years, I believed him, not because he wanted something, because he had finally stopped pretending. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my living room for a long time, thinking, reflecting. The strange thing was that hearing his apology didn't make me want him back. It simply gave me closure. The man who once walked away at the airport convinced he had won was gone. In his place stood someone humbler, someone wiser, someone forced to face the consequences of his choices. The transformation had cost him dearly, but perhaps not as dearly as remaining unchanged would have. A little over a year after Eric walked away from our marriage, I found myself standing in the ballroom of a charity fundraising event in downtown Chicago. The room was elegant without being extravagant. Round tables filled the space. Conversations drifted through the air, and a jazz trio played softly near the stage. Business leaders, nonprofit directors, local entrepreneurs, and community volunteers mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. A year earlier, I never would have attended something like this alone. Not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't have. For too many years, I had built my schedule around someone else's priorities. Now I was building a life around my own. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and took a moment to look around. The event wasn't connected to my divorce. It wasn't connected to Eric. It wasn't connected to revenge. And that perhaps was the greatest sign of how much my life had changed. The divorce had been finalized months earlier. The legal process was complete. The financial matters were settled. The emotional wounds had largely healed. Not perfectly, not completely. Life doesn't work that way. But enough. Enough to move forward. Enough to feel hopeful again. Enough to genuinely enjoy an evening without carrying the weight of the past. I was speaking with a client when I noticed movement across the room. A familiar figure had just entered. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. Then I did. Eric. He looked older. Not dramatically older. Just different. His posture had changed. His confidence no longer carried the edge of arrogance that once defined him. There was humility in the way he moved now. Humility, and perhaps a little regret. He hadn't seen me yet. I turned my attention back to the conversation and continued speaking naturally. A year earlier, his presence would have ruined my evening. Now it barely changed it. That realization surprised me, because healing isn't measured by how much anger you feel. It's measured by how little control the past still has over you. About 20 minutes later, I felt someone approach. I turned. Eric stood there. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled politely. "Claire." "Hi, Eric." He looked nervous, genuinely nervous. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same man who once boarded an international flight believing he held all the power. Now he seemed unsure of every word. "You look good," he said. "Thank you. You really do." I smiled politely. "So do you." It wasn't entirely true. He looked tired, but he looked healthier emotionally than he had during the darkest months after our separation. In a strange way, suffering had made him more human. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked. I considered it, then nodded. "Sure." We moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glowed against the night sky. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. Finally, Eric broke the silence. I almost didn't come tonight. Why? He gave a small laugh. I heard you might be here. I raised an eyebrow. And I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. The old version of Eric never would have worried about that. The old version assumed his presence was welcome everywhere. This version understood consequences. I don't mind seeing you, I said. His expression softened. Then he nodded. I guess that's more kindness than I deserve. For several seconds, we stood quietly. Then he surprised me. I wanted to thank you. I blinked. Thank me? Yes. I genuinely hadn't expected that. For what? Eric looked down briefly before answering. For not trying to destroy me. The statement hung between us. Interesting, because there had been a time when he truly believed I was trying to ruin his life. Now, he understood something different. The consequences he suffered weren't created by me. They were created by him. I simply stopped protecting him from them. I wasn't interested in destroying you, I said. I know that now. He smiled sadly. I didn't know it then. The honesty in his voice felt real. No manipulation, no strategy, just truth. A year ago, that would have mattered more. Now it simply felt peaceful. I spent months blaming you, he admitted, for everything. I remained silent. I blamed you for the divorce. He laughed softly. I blamed you for my financial situation. Another small laugh. I even blamed you when Vanessa left. That one almost made me smile. Eric shook his head. Eventually, I ran out of people to blame. The statement carried more wisdom than he probably realized. Because many people spend their entire lives avoiding responsibility. Very few develop the courage to confront themselves honestly. When that happened, he continued, I started seeing things differently. I nodded, then waited. I realized something. What? He looked directly at me. The worst thing I lost wasn't the money. I said nothing. It wasn't the house. Again, silence. It wasn't the business opportunities. His voice grew quieter. It was the person who spent 18 years believing in me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The ballroom noise faded into the background. And there it was, the truth. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just simple and devastating. I felt sadness, but not the kind that breaks you. The kind that reminds you life is complicated. People make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and sometimes they understand those mistakes only after the damage is done. I'm sorry, Claire. This time the apology landed differently, not because it was more eloquent, because it no longer carried expectations. He wasn't asking for another chance. He wasn't asking me to come back. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply telling the truth. And truth has a certain weight to it. I nodded. Thank you. A small smile appeared on his face. You know, he said, for a long time I thought your warning at the airport was a threat. I laughed softly. It wasn't. I know. His smile widened. It was a prediction. For the first time all evening we both laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the observation was accurate. A year earlier, I told him he would regret that trip. Not because I planned revenge, not because I intended to punish him, because I understood something he didn't. Choices have consequences, and eventually consequences arrive. Always. The music changed. People began moving toward the stage for the evening program. I glanced toward the crowd. I should get back. Eric nodded. Of course. For a brief moment, we simply stood there. Two people who once shared a life. Two people who took different paths. Two people who would never be husband and wife again. Yet somehow neither of us seemed angry anymore. Before leaving, I turned toward him one final time. I hope you're doing okay. His expression softened. I am. Then he smiled. Not perfect. I laughed. Nobody is. No. He shook his head. But I'm better than I was. I believed him. And surprisingly, I was glad. Because despite everything, I never wanted Eric destroyed. I wanted him accountable. There is a difference. Accountability teaches, destruction rarely does. As I walked back toward the crowd, I felt something settle quietly inside me. Peace. Not because I won. Not because he lost. Because the story was finally over. The greatest revenge wasn't taking his money. It wasn't humiliating him. It wasn't watching his life fall apart. The greatest revenge was rebuilding my own life, so completely that his betrayal no longer defined, and the greatest lesson was even simpler. Never underestimate the quiet people who hold a family together. Never mistake loyalty for weakness. Never assume the people who support you will always remain there, no matter how you treat them, because one day they may stop carrying your weight, and when they do, you'll discover exactly how much they were holding. Sometimes the most painful punishment isn't revenge at all. It's living with the consequences of your own choices. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on its message. Have you ever seen someone take loyalty for granted only to realize its value too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this one.